So then, we are back with modern understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, are refined in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find in a layer of understanding related with the spring feast, autumn feast, and the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. These are then the bulk of understandings of the 61st chapter, where then Yeshayahu the prophet mentioned regarding then also Yeshayahu chapter 1:8, and then returning of the cities and the first holy city of the time of the restoration period, obviously on the land of Cush as per the instructions of the prophet. So then with these in mind, we find ourselves then studying these holy documents. So then we can understand the first section of the spring feast related with the 61st, and then the autumn feast related known as vengeance, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. Obviously then Daniel the prophet, he also mentioned regarding the time of the seat from 1009 to 2009, where then obviously the holy cities were no longer around. And then after the time of the deceit, Daniel the prophet mentioned regarding then the coming of a time of precision, where then obviously the time of the dragon would be then this time after 2009. So then when the Messiah was born, he was born in 4999 if you count the starting of this age as 1,000 as properly described by the Hebrew language, because when a person is born already with a year old. So then the counting of the time per the instructions, we start counting then as 1,000. As we understand then, the Messiah spoke many times regarding the time of the end, where he himself spent 2 Yom creation days with the Samaritans, and he spent his time also on the top of Mount Gerizim, known as the Mount of Favor, because the Messiah was the favored one, and he was then obviously coming out of Jerusalem as the living tabernacling. And then he spent 2 Yom creation days with the Samaritans, indicating 2,000 years granted for the Gentiles. Then the Messiah came down from Mount Gerizim, and then he went back to Jerusalem, and then he was executed. While then he was on Mount Gerizim, then Galah, known as Revelation, then we find ourselves understanding this section of Revelation, where then we find the breaking of the seals were then opened as the Messiah then was transfiguring himself and showing himself before his disciples, and then showed up to him Moshe, symbolizing then obviously the law, and then Eliyahu symbolizing then obviously then the testimony or the law. We find in ourselves understanding this time where then when the Messiah was born, the mid-Tishri, it is equivalent of our September, mid-September, first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. Thus the Messiah then was born and tabernacled with his people. He was then the living tabernacling, and when he was born, then he was born already as the king. Thus his 1,000 years of kingship then had started. However, there was a period of transition from the first tabernacle service to the second tabernacle services, where then we get most of our instructions. Most of the religions today are using then instructions from the time of the transition from the first and second tabernacle services, rather than understanding then when the first holy city during the time of Yohanan was first built. Obviously then we find ourselves studying these documents, and then understanding when then the Messiah was around, he was explaining and he delegated responsibilities to his people, where then later with dispensation of Ruach HaKodesh, known as the Holy Spirit, and then he gave functions to the holy people. So then during the time of transition we find most of these documents, and unfortunately many of the religions, they describe themselves with some kind of a supernatural powers, themselves being Gentiles, and absolutely makes no sense. because the functions were only given to those who were from the lineage of Ibrahim, so then they would function as described then later sections of Corinthians and also Ephesians. Shaliach Shaul then mentioned those functions then his people were being delegated with. So then, during this time where we find ourselves after the time of the seat, so then the Messiah was born in 4999, mid-Tishri would be equivalent of mid-month of September, and then he was placed on a pole 5032. So then we find ourselves in understanding when he spent a couple of days with the Samaritans, indicated the Messiah then gave them couple thousand years, each of them one creation, Yom day. So from 5032 when he was put to death until then 2,000 years later, we find 5032, 2,000 makes 7032. We are in 7013. So you can imagine then the closing of this age, it is maximum of 7032. This age must be closed. So then we find ourselves during the time of 7013, where then we have roughly 20 years maximum of this age. So then the world must go through lots of transformations and then indicating the time of the trade of the end. Thus then when we read the news and understand then the Chinese being the dragon, we understand the centralized banking is ending itself, because then speaking from not only trade but its spiritual direct link with the dragon, as people then are more aware of the fact of the deceit spoken of by Shaliach Shaul. So then in 2 Corinthians 11:4, then Shaliach Shaul mentioned very precisely, he said, if any person comes to you and proclaims to you another Messiah, another gospel, another form of tabernacling, or then proclaiming a Messiah outside of the Holy of Holies, or then a Messiah going to and fro in the earth, then you have the false Messiah. As people are becoming more aware of, the Messiah must be in the Holy of Holies as per the instructions of the prophets and the law. The Holy Torah must be then done per the instructions, and the Messiah must then build his city on the land of Cush per the instructions of Yirmiyahu the prophet. Chapter 1:8 indicates then the first holy city on the land of Cush, and then description of the times and the seasons, spring and autumn, indicating already a direct understanding of the completion of the spring feast, and then the future completion of the autumn feast when the Messiah returns, and then the sounding of the shofars and the pouring of the cups. These obviously indicates Leviticus the 23rd chapter, where you find then the holy Moadim, or the holy feasts of the holy Hebrews, where we find ourselves then understanding the spring feast. When the Messiah came, he completed the spring feast. Then it is Leviticus the 23rd chapter, the first verse until the 21st verse. Then we find the completion of the spring feast. So then later when we read what Shaliach Shaul mentioned and the Torah or the instructions give us, then the shadow prophetic events. We are living during the shadow prophetic events, not the substance of the feasts themselves. We are not participants of the feasts of the past, but we are understanding the spiritual understanding of the prophecies from the shadow prophetic, from the Torah, from the instructions. So then the Gentiles can be useful for the Messiah, making testimony on his behalf, and then we understand we must produce fruit, speaking of the Messiah, only galaying the people. And galaying simply means a section of the holy instructions where then people are testified, or then they are instructed as far as understanding the multi-layers spoken of by the holy prophets. So then, the first 1,000 years when the Messiah was born, he was then born as the king, and the Messiah then in 1009 per the regular calendar. There was an event where then the Muslims came to Jerusalem and they leveled the city and they destroyed the tomb for the first time. thus indicating then the time of deceit afterwards, because the world made a declaration they do not want any part of themselves with the holy cities. Thus then the destroyer Nahashatan changed his name from destroyer to deceiver. Thus then 1,000 years of deceit, from 1009 to 2009, was the time of deceit, a time of people speaking of a Messiah outside of the Holy of Holies. Absolutely nonsense, because the Messiah must be in a Holy of Holies. So then after 09, then the prophet Daniel mentioned regarding then a peak of knowledge. Then we understand 08 and 09 there was truly a peak of knowledge, where then trade via computer was combined with the layer of understanding of Daniel the prophet. The knowledge would increase, but Daniel was not only a prophet, he was a tradesperson. And when speaking of trade, Daniel was an expert. And he indicated that the end would bring then, obviously, a trade using computerized systems. And this time, then, we are experiencing this time. And then we are understanding not only this, but then the decentralization of banking, so then people can be directly related with the dragon. And dragon is not a bad term. It is simply precision. Outside of the Holy of Holies or the holy cities, then the dragon must be absolutely the first. But then we can be related with the system and also related with the holy cities at the same time. So then we find ourselves understanding then why the world is going through so many changes and so many countries going bankrupt, because then the new Chinese system is the system of the dragon. It's simply a precision time. So then we find ourselves in understanding China in its many sections of this world, then backing up their systems with raw materials. As we understand it very plainly, around the world, China is obviously stocking up with raw materials. So then, in this September of this year, then we understand the G20 visit at the Soviet Union, where then the BRICS system must be then re-established. There are talks regarding then the banking of the BRICS. This banking obviously is a direct trade system outside of USD, or then the system so known as central banking. So then the dragon then later can have absolutely 100% control of the entire worldwide system. Only regarding precision. People are not going to be under the control of the dragon if they make a decision not to. But when they get online and they do trade via the system, absolutely they must be linked up with the dragon. It's simply a precision term. So then, during this time, we are studying then these facets, because then not only he has changed the facet from deceiver from 1009 to 2009, but then he has changed from deceiver, devil, or then mocker, then he at the moment he is the dragon. So then, Daniel the prophet, the 11th chapter, gives us then a very precise understanding of the time where then Daniel the prophet, as a tradesperson, mentioned very precisely the relationship of the Kingdom of the North, Soviet Union. As we understand, Soviet Union was then re-established then in May of this year, and then the Soviets are becoming then the power security of this world. So then, with this understanding, we find then the Kingdom of the East described in the Apocrypha, and the Apocrypha can be found in the Catholic Bible, where then is the only Bible available with the Apocrypha. And then you can read the extra writings of Daniel the prophet. Then the understanding of Bel and the dragon give us then the very precise understanding. The dragon and Bel give us then the understanding of the spirit related with this world's market or trade, where then the Babylonian system, a system of confusion, must give in to the dragon. Dragon then is China. So then we begin our quest understanding then the Kingdom of the North from the 11th chapter, then the Kingdom of the South, Africa. back then these could not be truly part of the understanding because the time was not yet given. From 1009 to 2009, it was the time of deceit. People could not understand the holy instructions precisely as people are understanding today. There were people aware of those facts, but then most people did not, because they were during the time of deceit. And many of us adults, every one of us adults, we were born during the time of deceit, from 1009 to 2009. So then, with this in mind, we find ourselves then studying the 11th chapter, where then the Soviet Union must have the sole 100% control of the security of the world. Because when we read the system, we find the designers then being China, you find then the Soviet Union and Africa. Why? Because when we read Daniel the prophet, he was obviously a prophet, but he was not only speaking of tabernacling, he was speaking of trade. He was a tradesperson. He was doing trade for the king, and he worked under many kings besides himself being an astronomer, because he advised his people, his Hebrew people, his friends. And 500 years prior of the starting of the spring feast, when Daniel was around, he said, "You people make sure you observe the star. There is a star coming from heaven indicating the birth of the Messiah, and when he then does show himself, you should take these gifts, make sure present before him." So then his people then, after the going of Daniel, his people then were aware of the star. From generation after generation, they always made mention. Daniel the prophet, he was enlightened by God himself, and he gave us these understanding, make sure we watch for this star. And sure enough, 500 years later, roughly, then the Messiah came, and then the spring feast was completed. So then, when we read then the understandings of so known as the New Testament, but does not exist New Testament. There are 4 recordings of the spring feast from 4 people, a couple of them from the Hebrew, and then a couple of them from the Gentiles. So then we find ourselves firstly, obviously studying the first writer, because he was Metchiahu, and Metchiahu obviously he was then from the lineage of the Hebrews. He was a Levite very acquainted with the works of the Holy Tabernacling. We find then afterwards Yohanan, he was one of the disciples, and then Yohanan was on the top of the Mount Gerizim with the Messiah when he was then transfigured, and showed up to him Moshe and Eliyahu in the spirit, and it was during the feast of the Tabernacles. That's why then the Messiah tabernacled with his people. That's why then known as Peter. Peter does not exist. His name was Shimon. Peter was rock in Aramaic. Thus then he was having a nickname, but his name never changed. His name was always Shimon. So then Shimon was there with the Messiah, and he saw himself, and he made a remark. Should we make tents here for you and for Moshe and Eliyahu? Because it was during the time of building sukkahs, building tabernacling, then understanding the feast when the Messiah would come. So then, afterwards, the Messiah then was explaining then the opening of the seals. So then when we read Gala, or then Revelation from the Holy Instructions, we find ourselves then only expecting the starting of the autumn feast from then on. So then the spring feast was completed, then the autumn feast we are waiting for. And when the Messiah came down from the mountain, the seals then were opened. We are only expecting the sounding of the shofars and the pouring of the cups, because those are related only with the vengeance. So then, returning then to Daniel the 11th chapter, we find ourselves in understanding, because Daniel started as a boy, himself and his friends. They were then sent from the Holy Land. They went then to Babylon, and they were trained in the ways of the Chaldeans. So then, as they were trained, then later the king liked the work of them very much, and Daniel was promoted along with his friends. So then in the 2nd chapter, you'll find Daniel then explaining a dream because king of Babylon had a dream from heaven. In this dream he saw a big statue. The statue had many kinds of metals, for instance gold and then silver. You find then obviously the center would be then known as the bronze. Then you find obviously the legs of iron, and then the base of the statue with iron and clay. We are during the time of the iron and the clay. We are in the vast section of the end of the statue, where then later comes the rock. The rock is the Messiah when he returns for his holy people, or the holy cities. So then, during this time of the base of the statue, as we understand, when the Roman Empire then obviously was ruined, it started then the time of the base of the statue with iron and clay, and they do not mix. But then there is a further refinement. Because nations would be mixed up, some of them strong, some of them weak. But then comes the time of the restoration period, where then there was a peak of knowledge, where then designers have to be placed in their positions. So then the trade of the end would granted the couple of sticks related with Ezekiel, the 37th chapter. So then you find the stick of authority of the Tabernacling being restored, first city on the land of Cush, then the second stick given to the Ishmaelites, or then the stick of authority via then the crude, because later in the future, when the freighters of the earth, as described by the Messiah, when you read Galah or Revelation, you find then the Messiah speaking of these freighters, and the Ishmaelites at the moment in the world, they hold the most petroleum in the world, because they have the control of the fuel that then powers then the freighters. Thus then the stick of authority of the Ishmaelites then is restored many years ahead yet. However, we find then the 11th chapter. The 11th chapter is a specific tailor-made holy instructions related of the time of the restoration period. The restoration period started in after 2009. So after 2009 and prior of 7032, there is a section of it, 2009, we can understand, or 7009 per the original calendar, until 7032, there is a section related with the time of the restoration of the holy cities, and then the Gentiles were included. Because when you read then Yeshayahu chapter 1:8, you find then the first holy city, and then the Gentiles taking care of the land around it. Back then, during the time of Israel, no Gentile was ever in charge of the service of the land. The service of the land was then granted for the Gentiles. So then when you read Revelation, the 6th chapter, testifying on behalf of the Messiah is a type of a service. So the Gentiles were granted with the servicing the Messiah on behalf of his holy tabernacling. Simply what you are hearing is galaying, or then servicing. Thus we understand from the time of tabernacling, and then what Gentiles would do their part in then bearing fruit. So then the northern kingdom, we find then, we are understanding the Soviets are then in charge of the security of the world. Then you find the kingdom of the east is China, the decentralized banking system, and the kingdom of the south is Africa. Africa is the kingdom of the south. So these are the designers. These are the people then in September coming up with a system so then the world can benefit from their work. The particulars of this visit is absolutely 100% up to them, as long as the decentralized banking system from China is implemented, and then the way they make the ramifications from then on is completely up to them. How they're going to do from there, and then other countries, how they're going to relate with freighting, how they're going to relate with finances, and then the synchronizing of the regular central bank with the virtual. These details are not mentioned on our holy instructions. And thus far we have no holy prophet per the instructions of Yeshayahu the prophet, so then we could make inquiries of, but the prophet not available. So then we have to understand then the flow of events from the holy instructions, and simply then expect later in the future then a prophet available for the particulars, so then they can receive straight from heaven what they should do and what not, as they ask for. It won't be given them, but they have to ask for, because the function of the holy cities is to prune the holy city itself, or the Jerusalem, because Zechariah must be yet completed. So then when we understand Zechariah, there is a section of the holy instruction, a layer of understanding, where then 10 Gentiles would get a hold of the garment of the holy Hebrew, and they would try to get teachings from them. But the holy Hebrews, it's not their work to do then the service. The service is granted on behalf of the Gentiles. So then the holy Hebrews, they have a specific objective. Their objective is to do the route from the holy cities to Jerusalem, and to prune Jerusalem from then false teachings. Thus then we understand the functioning people doing their work from each city up to Jerusalem and then back. Then we can observe the times and the seasons, and then spring and autumn, and then revitalizing the holy Moadim, or then the holy feasts of the Creator Himself. But then the Gentiles, they can participate in the holy cities, but they must maintain their mouths shut. They can't speak while then the holy people are functioning. When the Creator has a remark, then He will speak through His people, through His holy Hebrew people. And if there are concerns, then the Gentiles doing the service will be known. At the moment, our function as Gentiles is simply galaying the people, producing fruit, showing the holy instructions, showing the holy Torah, showing then the people what then the holy prophets did throughout the ages, understanding Daniel, understanding Ezekiel, understanding the time of the restoration period, and preparing the time and preparing the way for the returning of the holy city and the holy cities, so then we can get an opening of a trail for the holy Hebrews, so that they can do their task and resume then the second holy services as per the instructions of the Messiah himself. Because the Messiah said in Galah chapter 1:8, or Revelation chapter 1:8, the Messiah gave a specific understanding for his people then to come out of the system of trade and then return to the holy services. But this is understanding from the Messiah himself and his people. The Messiah has to deal with his people, make sure they finished the holy work. We Gentiles, we only do Galah. We don't pray with people, we don't lay hands on people, we don't name heaven upon the people, we don't say the holy name of the Creator in prayers. We simply Galah the people, we reveal the holy instructions. We reveal the multi-layers of the holy instructions, and let Ruach HaKodesh do the rest of the work. So then, as we understand then, the Soviet Union responsible then for the security of the world, so then other nations can retrieve and rebuild. This means the United States and then the great nations of this world, if they are involved in world's problems, they must try to finish it up and then retrieve and rebuild themselves. Because the Creator has shown us those who are humbling themselves before the mighty hand of the Creator, then He is able to do His mighty work. If nations, they don't retrieve and they don't rebuild, then they are against the Creator, and it is always a problem. Every time Israel did not do what the instructions or the layers of instructions were showing, they always got themselves in trouble. So then, as we understand the past, we understand the future, we understand Galah and its multi-layers of understanding, then we get in line with the future, so then we can do our very best and produce fruit as service people, as those doing Galah or testifying, as Revelation the 6th chapter then give us. Those who are then making testimonies on behalf of the Messiah would speak of Him, while then the holy people are engaged with the holy cities and pruning Jerusalem from its false teachings. So then, as we understand, What can we as a nation, for instance, Brazil, very nice country, what could then Brazil do to benefit the system of precision? There is none other than providing raw materials for China. And this is what then we began our quest of understanding September as the initiation of the new system as per instructions. Because the Messiah in the future, he said, and the freighters of the earth. And because of the couple of sticks of Ezekiel, the 37th chapter, the system of banking, centralized banking, was produced, was generated during the time of the seat. From 1009 to 2009, centralized banking is to manipulate the market so then people would be under the control of governments. But the Messiah does not want governments to control the people. They want the people to control themselves. They want the people to become governors of themselves. That's why later in the future, when the people they get in the computer, they themselves are governing and providing then taxes via the freighters. This means, very simply, as the world is becoming decentralized from central banking, when you then later make a purchase via online, you receive then your parcel, your package. Governments can only receive taxes if they make a deal with the freighters. This means taxation must be included with freighting, tracking numbers, and then understanding each item of the package, so then they can have description, price, and taxes being removed instantly, and then the governments receive these via internet instantly when the label is generated. Thus providing taxes for governments after, only after what the Messiah said in the future and the freighters of the earth. The Messiah saw the authority given to the freighters when speaking outside of tabernacling. So then, obviously, there must have then a security system around the world, and the Soviets were granted. So if you read then the 11th chapter of Daniel, you find then the Soviet Union with a couple of statuses. Then the Kingdom of the North at the end would have a higher status than the first. As we understand, the Soviet Union was very popular during the time of the Cold War, but then unfortunately went down for some time. Now the Soviet Union came back, and their position, their status is going to become higher than the first. So if you were born during the 50s and you kind of remind yourself of the times of the Cold War, Soviet Union was very strong. But then in the very near future, they're going to become stronger than the first. So then we begin our quest understanding then the prophet Daniel, explaining then the Soviet Union, becoming then the power security of the world. So then we do our utmost then make sure in providing those raw materials required for the system of precision. Because as the system becomes available, then the power is taken from the government and given to each individual. So then as each individual, they receive the power from decentralized banking. Then the government is going to be dependent upon the people, rather than the people becoming dependent upon the government. So during this time of the restoration must be a reverse, so then the system of Ishmael then is implemented. This is how Ishmael, as the king, granted authority to those people working under him, doing trade on his behalf, but then they were directly related with Ishmael. Thus, precisely this way must be then re-established. So then the Arabs, later in the future, they can control the market, not by interference, but by then the movements of trade as they observe fit via then the petroleum, because they hold the fuel to do those. So then lots of changes coming up. We find then obviously Australia being very diligent, in New Zealand. We find the United States unfortunately with lots of trouble, and they are trying to control the world, control yet the central bank, but it's not going to work. It's going truly to fail. And IMF and even the Prime Minister of Israel, 2 years ago, they gave a very important interview stating if United States would not straighten out the economy in 5 years, then USD would be ruined. So then roughly there is then left only 30 months for the United States then to get their situation then straightened out and make sure they come up with USDV, or then the virtual monetary system, so then later the conversion from yuan virtual can be then easily obviously synchronized with the price related with then USDV, because most of our reports are from central bank as far as the economy of China, but they do not have the reports of direct trade, and it is as important as then centralized banking. So then much more coming up, please stay tuned. And then we're going to study later the 62nd chapter of Yeshayahu, then is a direct relation with the Ishmaelites. So then we understand what it meant of having the golden turbans, and then the granting of the authority again given then to the Ishmaelites with a direct trade system. It's a decentralized system, so then people can have the power and no longer governments. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.